Staying in France, this week the country inaugurated a new space command headquarters in the southern city of Toulouse. President Emmanuel Macron oversaw its opening. He warned of what he called the brutalization of space warfare. He also announced an additional 4.2 billion euros in funding for France's military space activities through 2030. Take a listen to Emmanuel Macron.
C'est pour cela qu'après avoir transformé l'armée de l'air en armée de l'air et de
After
l'espace,
turning the
nous
Air
avons créé
Force
le
into the
commandement
Air
de
and
l'espace.
Space Force,
Voilà pourquoi
we
nous
created
sommes
the
ici.
Space Command.
Je tenais à
That's why we're
célébrer
here.
notre première
I wanted to
capacité
celebrate the
opérationnelle de ce
operational
commandement de
capacity of
l'espace
our
qui
Space
incarne
Command,
la mise en
which
œuvre
embodies our
de la
2019
stratégie
Space
spatiale de
Defense
défense de
Strategy.
2019.
We also
Voilà
decided to
aussi
increase
pourquoi nous
funding
avons
for space
décidé,
as
dans le
part of the
cadre de
defense law,
l'actualisation de la loi de
an
programmation
additional
militaire,
4.2
des
billion
marges
euros
supplémentaires
for
réservées aux
2026 to
spatiales,
2030 on top of what had already been
sur la période
allocated.
2026-2030, en plus de ce qui avait été programmé.
Well, for more on the militarization of space, we can bring in Mark Hilborne, a senior lecturer in the School of Security Studies at King's College London. Good morning. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Here.
Now, you are someone who's in the field of security studies. How much attention does outer space security tend to get? Is it something that's a growing issue in your field?
It's a growing issue. It's something I often make the joke that we've been working in a vacuum when we think about space security. It's something that hasn't really until very recently gained, I think, attention. And as we've seen in Ukraine, space has a fundamental part to play in modern warfare. So certainly growing in terms of the attention and the budgets.
Can you talk a bit more about what you mentioned in Ukraine? I mean, how are we seeing the interaction between what's happening in space and what's happening on the real battlefield?
I mean, Ukraine is a phenomenal example of what we call sensor to shooter capabilities. The Ukraine have been very good at orchestrating rather than originating a lot of the technology. So using things like Starlink for both command and control and the piloting, the maneuvering and navigating of UAVs and USVs, surface vehicles, maritime vehicles. So finding that a number of these space capabilities, as well as imagery, are fundamental, a sort of fundamental backbone to military operations in the current environment.
And are we seeing Russia sort of fight back in any way? I mean, has the battle, what happens in space is impacting the battlefield. Have we seen the battle sort of moving into space in any way?
Well, there isn't let's say, a war in space, but there is things like, and a constant efforts of jamming and other kind of what we might call sub-threshold capabilities where a state might try to dazzle or to spoof a signal coming from a satellite, so to reduce the efficiency or effectiveness. That doesn't mean there can't be a shooting war in space or an all-out confrontation in space, but so far we haven't seen that. One of the problems is as soon as you start any kind of confrontation, you risk a kind of shooting war in space, and that creates debris, and that, of course, doesn't suit anybody, any space operators. So you have to be very cautious about taking any of those kind of actions in space. But we constantly see these sub-threshold activities, whether they're cyber attacks, or as I said, spoofing, and jamming on a wide scale. So we've seen GPS signals, for instance, jammed, which is affecting civilian flights across Europe. So these are a fairly frequent activity that Russia's undertaking.
Do you think that we're going to see more of that, and that it's going to come, and as you said, it can impact flights? I mean, there are a lot of satellites floating around in space that have civilian uses. Do you think it's something that regular people are going to be feeling more impacted by?
Potentially. I mean, I think as we rely more on space, we'll find that any attack on space will fundamentally impact what we do. Things like the GPS systems, the GNSS systems globally, like Galileo and GPS, they are so fundamental to so many things that we do that any kind of attack on those, disrupting those signals, can have an impact on banking and stock exchanges, things like our electricity grids. All of these rely on the timing signal that come from these GNSS type systems. And any kind of attack on those and jamming those can have fundamental effects. So we may well see, many things that we take for granted, all the way through, as I said, from the stock market to your pizza delivery guy, all of these rely on this signal from space. And it's relatively vulnerable. So quite possibly we could see further attacks, and that could impact our daily lives.
And as you mentioned, the financing that countries are putting into space security is increasing. What do you think of the plan laid out by Emmanuel Macron this week, and how does France compare to other countries?
Well, France has a mature capability in terms of many aspects in terms of space. There's launch, there's a satellite building, and ground stations. But France and Europe more widely doesn't yet quite function at the full level of the major competitors like the US or China or Russia in terms of an integrated space capability. But we are starting to the recognition by Macron, and I think the EU generally have looked at space and are recognizing space as a strategic domain. We're starting to see space, it's always been a bit of a taboo to put weapons in space, and the main treaties try and limit that. But increasingly, we talk about space as a strategic domain or an operational domain, or even a domain of warfighting. So we're starting to see this creep in. So there's a kind of reality that we need to take defensive action in space. And so France, with this recent move, and the European Union, they're starting to recognize a number of ways of looking at space. In 2023, there was the EU Space Strategy for Security and Defense, which laid out a number of key areas of action. But one of the problems we have, the French plan, we also have the EU, and of course, then we have NATO. So there's this fragmentation and the number of levels in terms of Europe's space and the defensive space becomes a problem. There's many states, there's many different agencies, national programs, there's different priorities, a different procurement, and different industrial bases. And so that can slow down the decision-making process and affect the kind of scale economies that, say, the US, for instance, enjoys. So from a French/European perspective, there's that capability gap, which is because of the complications of multiple layers, that becomes difficult to amalgamate. But nonetheless, France and Europe more generally have all the capabilities there. It's kind of unifying and amalgamating them and making them work as one, I think, is the key difficulty.
And just sort of concretely, what does defensive action in space look like? I mean, what's this money actually going towards?
Well, there's a number of ways, I suppose, that you have to think of defensive action. It can be quite broad, like, for instance, the sovereign access to space. You're no longer reliant on another actor. So we've seen the US, for instance, in a number of different ways, change its kind of support for different actors. So you want to make sure that you have the sovereign access, whether it's launchers, satellites, or ground systems, and minimize the reliance on other players. But things like hardening satellites and ground infrastructure, so you're protecting against the kind of things I mentioned before, like jamming or spoofing or cyber intrusion, or things like directed energy weapons like lasers. It's notable that in the Ukrainian conflict, the first strike, if you will, was a cyber attack on the Viasat satellites upon which Ukraine relied for its satellite communication. So it's hardening against those kind of things. And other things like what we call space domain awareness is actually just being able to track and see and characterize what's in space. So we know what's up there, and we know who is maybe doing things that they shouldn't be doing. And also things like developing redundancy and backup systems. These are all important when we're thinking of defending against space. It's not necessarily blasting someone else's satellite. There's many, many things that we can do in terms of redundancies to help deter or shake off a kind of attack in space.
It's a fascinating topic, and I'm sure we'll be talking about it much more in the future. Mark Hilborne, thank you again so much for joining us this morning. That was Mark Hilborne, a senior lecturer in the School of Security Studies at King's College London.